The state of hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel is gonna be extremely weird, wacky, and unpredictable. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I thought this was a really interesting discussion to have. So let's start off with how hand traps might die or might not die. There's a lot of discussion to be had, but mainly revolving around tier limits, Kashtira, Sprite, I guess, Mathmech to a limited extent, and Master Duel as a whole being kinda wacky. The reason I'm discussing this is because in a general Joshua Schmidt video, as I've done multiple times in the past, I got inspired. He talked about how hand traps just aren't really that good, and it got me thinking, do they though? And yeah, I genuinely agree, but what does this mean for Master Duel players? Because, well, Master Duel's built different. In a good way, a bad way, who the fuck knows? It's different, to say the least. So what we can learn from the TCG and the OCG is going to be far different from what we can learn from the OCG as a TCG player. So let's, I guess, discuss the efficacy of hand traps, possibly in the future. The main point I want to bring out is that a majority of hand traps are absolute doo-doo water in the current TCG landscape, save for a certain genre of hand traps, which is Graveyard Hate. Now, why is that? It's very obvious. It's tier limits. Graveyard Hate is perfect against tier limits. D-Shifter, the Bestials, Skullmeister, I guess DD Crow, anything that banishes from grave is great. Anything that sends to grave or is some way analogous of send something to grave with card effect is absolutely horrible in the current metagame. So, yeah, I guess let's just move on from there and start discussing things, shall we? So, what gives? Why are hand traps really bad? Why would Ash die or not be good in the first place? Well, the answer is relatively simple, and that's the fact that from the Power of the Elements set, which includes Mathmech to a limited extent, a lot of decks become extremely non-linear, very easy and not easy, but very fun to pilot, but more importantly, they don't lose very much to hand trap. They can play through multiple things, they can still put up some things, and, well, they can always just come back the next turn and do shenanigans, right? Sprite is a pretty good example of this, where any multiple level 2s is basically just combo, and you can still do things like Elf, you can still do things like IP Masquerena. Literally, the sky's the limit. Your gigantic Sprite isn't the end of your combo if it gets ashed or something. Additionally, who's to forget about tiers? Holy shit, Ash does nothing to them. Veiler is fine, they can just do something else unless they open god-awful. And, Ghost Spell, Ghost Ogre, all those things aren't good unless your opponent is specifically running Pellerino, so you can, I guess, pop that with Ghost Ogre, and now they can't out your skill drain, but that begs the question, why are you playing skill drain anyways? That's unbased. And so that is essentially the shortened version of why hand traps become kind of bad in the current metagame, except for the graveyard stuff. But why exactly does that work? How do the tier limits even work? Why are they such a big fucking deal? Why is it that only the Bestials, which I'll tell you about later, why is that only DD Crow, Skullmeister, Dimension Shifter are good in the first place in the TCG in the current format? Well, it's time to introduce you Master Duel Babbies to Tier 0. So, let's first talk about the tier limits monsters. I have made a singular video on them, which is currently my best ever performing short, so maybe watch that. But basically, the tier limits have a couple of really interesting things about them. Number one, they are a fusion deck that overcomes all the inefficiencies of fusion monsters. You see, if you summon fusion monsters normally, which is get a fusion spell in your hand, have multiple monsters in your hand or the field, send them to the graveyard with a fusion spell and summon them, that's a lot of things you have to get on your field or in your hand to then summon a fusion monster. It's wildly inefficient, only outrivaled by ritual monsters and how dogshit garbage they are. Now, you can also use things like Shut All Fusion or Branded Fusion, which send things directly from the deck to graveyard, but the issue with that is that it helps you deck out much faster, which is an issue when you're facing against Runic or the Ishizu Millers, which, if you're not playing a deck that can capitalize off of them, then you're not in for a good time. Plus, the thing with Branded is that you need your Branded of Albazes to be in deck so that you can constantly keep on activating the Branded Fusion and then recycle it. So it's not exactly great when you run out of Albazes to put in the graveyard, because you only realistically run one or two of them. So yeah, especially if your opponent banishes them, tough luck, I guess. Except for Lubellion. Lubellion can put that shit back in the deck, so you don't really worry if it's banished in that case. And the problem with banishing things from the graveyard to perform a fusion summon is that first you have to spend resources to put that in the graveyard, and then spend resources to find a way to banish them in the first place, but then it's very unlikely that you can get those banished cards back, and the decks that can usually don't do it very often or just aren't that good. I'm sorry, mutants. So that leaves us with the tier limits, which are kind of the best in terms of resource efficiency and kind of just decide to negate those prior issues, because they fusion summon themselves by shuffling themselves back into the deck from the hand, field, or graveyard, which is very, well, as I said, resource efficient. The way they do this is that 3 of your main deck Tearlament monsters, except for Rhinoheart, can, when sent to the graveyard, perform a fusion summon. This fusion summon lets you shuffle things from your graveyard, hand, or field back into the deck in any order at the bottom of your choice, and then perform the fusion summon. For any fusion monster, you don't get locked into anything at all. You're not fusion locked for some crazy reason, and most importantly, and this is the one reason why Graveyard Interruption is so powerful, the Tearlament monster that activated the effective fusion summon when sent to the graveyard must be in the graveyard for this to resolve. So if you shuffle it back in the deck, or if it's banished, then that's really bad. And Tearlaments only have one realistic way of getting back banished monsters, and you at best run at one, which is Tearlament's Crime, which sometimes you don't run in favor for Tearlament's Celiac. And so this is why the DD Crows, the Dimension Shifters, and the Bystials are so important. And the second reason why Tearlaments are so good is because they mill. Now, most of your cards, as I just mentioned, except for Rhinoheart, can mill the top 3 cards of your deck. Like Havnus can do it during your opponent's turn, which is stupid crazy, Merly on summon does it, and Shiren having one of the hardest to pull off, which is not saying much, and greatest payoffs lets you send a card from hand to graveyard, then mill 3 on special summon, meaning you didn't use your normal summon. And if you sent a Tearlament off with this effect, then you can conduct multiple fusion summons depending on what you mill. But of course, milling is heavily inconsistent, so why exactly are Tearlaments good? I mean, sure, if you draw enough of them or get lucky, that's fine, but why is this so good in the first place? Introducing the Ishizu cards. I'm gonna take this really simply because the Ishizu cards are a whole nother beast I don't want to tackle right now. But basically, the Ishizu cards are monsters retrained after Ishizu's dogshit normal monsters in the anime, and they're separated into 2 different types: the cards that mill and the cards that shuffle. The cards that shuffle can shuffle cards from either player's deck back into the graveyard as a quickie, and that's really good for very obvious reasons, including getting rid of your Tearlament monsters, or putting back your own from being DD Crowed. And the second is that you have Agido and Kelbeck, which are your millers, where if they're sent from the top of the deck to the graveyard, they get to mill the top 5 cards of both players' decks. Now, considering that you're milling Tearlament cards anyways, you're going to be milling most of the time upwards of 10 to 11 cards per turn at the very least, especially if you have a Havnus and you mill something like an Agido or a Kelbeck, as I just mentioned. That is multiple mills on your opponent's turn, and a lot of fusion summons, which means Dragostapelia, Garden Chimera. The options are very much there, and you don't have a restriction on the number of monsters you can shuffle from hand, field, or graveyard with the effects of the Tearlament's monsters. Only restriction, again, is that you have to shuffle them back into the deck, which is required as a condition for it to resolve. And so, with the addition of the Ishizu shufflers and millers, you're either able to very consistently mill enough cards to guarantee to hit something, at least 95% of the time, or you're able to get a way to recycle them so that they don't get hit by your opponent's removal, which everyone is playing. Now, the second component to this are the Bystials, the only really good hand traps because they're like DD Crows but way better. You see, the Bystials are a series of level 6 dragon monsters which have one in common condition. It's that if your opponent controls a monster, they can quick effect banish a light or dark, which is every single Tearlament, they're all darks except for Rhinoheart, which isn't the one that fusion summons, from either player's graveyard, and then summon themselves, and then during the end phase, they have some pretty nasty effects, like Magnemute searching for a level 6 dragon, which is very generic, but can also search for things like Druisworm, which is another Bystial, that banishes stuff face down on the field, and yes, during the end phase, if you summon the Bystial Magnemute, search for Druisworm, then Druisworm can summon itself during that same end phase, which is kinda crazy. And not to mention that this effect is a quickie if your opponent controls a monster, otherwise it's spell speed 1, but your opponent's gonna control monsters very often of the time anyway, so they're very good hand traps to say the least, and they're not negs. You summon them from hand to the field, you're not negging. During the end phase with Magnemute in particular, you're +1ing, and with Druisworm, you're making your opponent go neg, so in total card economy, you are still gaining 1. And so, a game of chicken ensues. You're trying to mill your Tearlament's names, and you're doing that more consistently with the Ishizu cards. Your opponent's trying to banish them, but then you're trying to shuffle them back, and so it's just kind of like an eternal cycle of mill, oh no, banish, oh shuffle back, and it's more like managing your Tearlaments that are banished and not banished already. The only true choke point that the deck has is that they banish Tearlament's Kid Kalos, but that's hard enough because Tearlament's Kid Kalos doesn't go to the graveyard often enough, at least in the cases of me playing the deck with Branded Tear as my own. And so yeah, most hand traps aren't really good because currently the only deck worth playing is Tearlaments, and to be fair, I find them extremely fascinating and fun to play with, but Tier 0 is generally not a good thing to be in, except for right now. It's very divisive, and I don't really want to start something right now until I have more experience piloting the deck, but for now, yeah, they're the only really good things. The only thing that has changed about the TCG current metagame with hand traps in regards is that the Kashtira are here. Now, what are the Kashtira, and why do they kind of negate the whole, nothing but DD Crows are good? Well, the Kashtira are a semi-splashable sort of deck that can be also made pure. That's really good. It's currently doing extremely well in the OCG and the TCG before the terrible ban list in the OCG and even after. And basically, they set up a macrocosmos, they aren't affected by the Bystials, and therefore the Bystials have one thing that they can't really counter, which means, well, tough shit. And a lot of decks can run Ishizu Tears and Kashtiras, which I'm pretty sure they can make that macrocosmos. So this becomes kind of dog shit, which kind of raises up all other hand traps like Nib or Ash or Ghost Ogre, because, well, the Kashtiras are vulnerable to them, but the Ishizu Tears aren't, and the Kashtira kind of either topple the Ishizu Tears or ally with them. So really, this game of chicken is kind of disturbed by a big ol' macrocosmos. I did that for dramatic effect. And so we now come to Master Duel. How are we being affected by this bullshit? Well, we might not. You see, the thing is, most hand traps are either tailored specifically to beat the tier limits, or can do really good against Kashtira, but even considering before we get Kashtira, which we're not going to get them for a long time unless Konami is going to scheme up something weird, we have one thing that tier limits actually can't do much against, because despite how bad hand traps are, if you draw enough of them and nothing else, you're going to do so much to tier limits, although you can't actually play the game on your own. And the reason why is Maxx C. Now, I'm aware the OCG has them at 1, but we have it at 3. Maxx C isn't a vulnerability towards the Bystials because it's not a light nor dark, and also, it technically doesn't send your opponent shit to the graveyard, meaning the tier limits can't actually plus off of the supposed interruption that the hand traps offer, or the negging that they give your opponent, which is just an Ash, and oh look, oh no, my mill has been stopped. I will just normal summon Rhino Heart, send another card to the graveyard, and make a Kid Kalos. And so yeah, I didn't really think this one completely through because, well, I'm not a video essayist, but I am someone who likes to discuss, so I would like to bring the floor to the viewers. What do you think will happen with the current Master Duel meta and the introduction of tier laments and sprites, and then later down the line Ishizu Tears, because we know what's happening. We already have Magnificent Maven cards in the form of Linkage, and we do have a card in the form of Circular, which indicates the release of it. I mean, same general time frame, so who knows? Do you think the addition of tier laments and Ishizu tier laments later down the road will change the Master Duel metagame and make hand traps basically an instant dismantle? Or do you think the sole existence of Maxx C in making the drawing of hand traps much better will see to their life? Let me know, and well, if you want to see more discussion content, check the video right up there in the doobly-doo. It's more discussion, but maybe a little less nuanced. It's also based on another creator sort of stuff, so yeah, check it out, I guess. Peace.